If you're an experienced YouTuber, you know that topics are more important than thumbnails, and thumbnails are more important than videos. But what if I were to tell you that there's something that's even more important than any of these? I call it the most important part of YouTube strategy because without it, your thumbnails won't get clicks and your videos will get clicked off. Even worse, you can screw it up in every stage of the video creation process, leading to you not quite getting the results you might want. So what is it? What is the most important part of YouTube strategy? The answer is clarity. Clarity refers to how easily something can be understood. And there's 5 key areas you really don't want to mess it up, starting with thumbnails. Now at this point you might be thinking, this doesn't make sense. How is clarity more important than making a thumbnail that pops out or choosing a topic that's super interesting? Well, the answer is that it doesn't matter how interesting your thumbnail is if the viewer can't clearly understand it. And same with your topic, your title, your editing, and your scripting. And that brings us to the first mistake I want to talk about, which is misusing colors and brightness. Let's look at this thumbnail. What's the goal? What are you supposed to look at? The answer is the subject, this guy with the bat from Dude Perfect. But there's several mistakes going on here that deter your eyes from focusing on that. In other words, you're not clearly looking at the subject. The biggest one is that this background is glaring white. It's the brightest element in the thumbnail, yet you shouldn't be looking there. And second, you have this super saturated background. So you have brightness and saturation, 2 things that draw the human eye, and neither of them are on the subject. Third, over here, we have low saturation and brightness on the face, which is where the viewer should be focusing. So I mocked up a quick before and after in Photoshop. Nothing pretty, but just to show you what I mean here. In the after, you can see how much more we focus on the subject after lowering the background saturation, removing that background glare, popping the highlights on the face, and then raising the saturation of the subject. As you can see, it's a pretty night and day difference, and it allows the viewer to focus on the subject, making it easier to quickly understand this thumbnail. The second mistake is pretty similar, and it's distracting elements. So we have this MKBHD thumbnail here, where the only thing that changes here is the background. On the left, the original thumbnail had this blown out window that was just grabbing your attention. And then on the right, we used AI to just make it a similar background. And you can see how much easier it is to focus on the headphones here. Again, the viewer can't clearly understand the messaging of your thumbnail if they're looking in the wrong place, which is why you want to keep an eye out for distracting elements such as a very bright window. And when it comes to distracting elements, there's one simple question you have to ask yourself. You want to look at every single element in your thumbnail and ask yourself, does this element need to be here? Can we remove it to create a more coherent and clear thumbnail? For mistake number 3, we're going to play a little game. I'm going to show you a thumbnail only for a couple of seconds, and then you have to guess what that thumbnail is kind of about. Ready? Go. Chances are, if your IQ isn't 300, you probably have no idea what's going on in a thumbnail, or at least what the video is about. And that's mistake number 3, failing the glance test. This is a really simple test where you just take a quick glance at the thumbnail to see if you can easily understand it or not. Again, this ties back to clarity. If the viewer can't understand the thumbnail in a couple seconds, then they're gonna move on. In this case, all the individual elements are pretty clear enough, but it takes too long to actually understand what's going on, mostly because of this little thing over here. I have no idea what that is, even after having stared at this image for hours making this slide deck. This is a test that I use for every single thumbnail I make, because it lets me find out if I can easily and quickly understand what's going on, aka, is the thumbnail clear or not? Mistake number 4 is interesting because it pulls in a little bit of human psychology. So if this was a very clear thumbnail, all you would look at would be the pizza and then the 2 people. But what happens here is you have a straight wall that's, very simple, and then at the far right, you have this pattern interrupt. It breaks the design of the flat wall behind them. And what I found out is that when something breaks a pattern, it draws attention to itself because it's out of the norm. In addition to this, it's very noisy, like there's a lot going on there, like there's a lot of detail, and it drags the eye towards there. Again, this makes it hard for the viewer to clearly understand the messaging of the thumbnail, lowering the overall clarity. So the broad theme so far has been, we have a main subject that we want the viewer to look at in the thumbnail, but there are things distracting from that, lowering the clarity of the thumbnail. This is a similar mistake where you have contrasting hues. So if you look at the overall color of the thumbnail, it's a very warm hue. But the backboard to this guy's seat is more of a bluish color, and it just grabs attention because it contrasts the yellow of the thumbnail. So the first thing I look at when I see this thumbnail isn't the food, which is what I should be looking at. It's this kind of backboard behind the main character here. So again, it does not matter how interesting your thumbnail is. If it's not clear and easy to understand, viewers are just never going to click on it. And small tweaks like this, like changing mistakes like this, can make a big difference in making it extremely easy for the viewer to understand what's going on. Because if they can't understand what's going on, they can't be intrigued. So if we dive a little bit deeper in this thumbnail, the concept of this thumbnail is that we're showing a man who's about to eat a huge meal. Those are the only two important elements of this thumbnail. So anything that distracts from that is lowering the thumbnail's clarity, because that's what we want to show to intrigue the viewer. So in this case, the fact that I'm looking at this backboard seat thing instead of the actual food and the expression of the man, that's a bad thing. Now, this is only one of the 5 key areas you don't want to mess up, and the next one is titles. Now, when it comes to clarity in titles, visual weight is a big mistake I see all the time, aka there's just a word vomit being thrown at the potential viewer. So in this case, in the before, you can see we have Little Nightmares 2, Final Boss and Ending, Secret Ending, 4K Ultra HD 60 FPS. We're just throwing so much unnecessary information to the viewer they don't need to know. They have to read through and digest all of this when we could just make a simpler and easier to read title like All 17 Boss Fights in Little Nightmares 2. Boom. One of these titles is way easier to process while the other is just word vomit. It's forcing the viewer to read through too much stuff and making the title's clarity overall lower. Title mistake number 2 is lack of reading clarity. Now, this slide should answer the age-old question, should I make my titles all cap or no? People are saying you should make them all caps because it pops out more and grabs the viewer's attention. And the reason you shouldn't is because of low shape contrast. If you look at this bottom title, there's high shape contrast for each word, aka it's easy to distinguish each letter and each word from each other. Versus if you look at the all caps title, it's just a straight line here. There's very low shape contrast. So while the top one might stand out more, the second one is going to be easier to read in milliseconds. Now, one thing I will add here is that this mistake is way less important than the other mistakes we've talked about so far, but it's an interesting one, so I wanted to share it. Mistake number 3 when it comes to clarity in titles is not having conceptual clarity. And this is an example I made up to really show what I'm talking about. So here we have a video by Veritasium, and title 1 is The Art of Making the Wakizashi. And then the second title is How Japanese Masters Turn Sand into Swords. Now, the first one, you're probably asking yourself, what the hell is a wakizashi? You've probably never heard of that, you know? Versus the second one, anybody can understand. And that's a big thing here. When you're writing your title, you want to make sure that the broadest possible audience can understand your title. So when you're writing your title, keep in mind, am I writing this title in a way that the broadest possible audience can understand it or not? It's fine if you don't, but that just means you're going to cut out segments, possibly huge segments of audiences who would have been interested in that video. That's 2 key areas covered, and the third one is editing. Now, the concept I want to really focus on for this is viewer gaze. And viewer gaze just refers to where the viewer is looking at during a scene in your video. And this is really important because the viewer can't properly understand and enjoy the video if they're not even looking at the right thing at the right time. A great example comes from this YouTube short that I got back from an editor a couple weeks ago. At the top here, we have the thumbnail of Mr. Beast that I was breaking down in the short. And then all the way at the bottom here, we had the subtitles, which was forcing the viewer to choose, should they look at the image or should they look at the subtitle? And guess what? If the viewer chooses to look at the subtitles, you're fresh out of luck because instead of being intrigued by whatever was up here, they're looking down at the subtitles and not understanding the context. This is a big reason I'm not a huge fan of subtitles because a lot of YouTubers do it wrong where they don't use it in an additive way, they use it in a way that distracts from what's actually going on in the video. The easy fix for this was just removing all this space that the viewer's eyes had to travel, putting the subtitles right under the thumbnail so that the viewer could easily look at both without having to move their eyes much. Now, when it comes to clarity in editing, a big issue I see all the time is overloading the viewer. So again, this is from the same short. On the left, we had this scrolling animation of a YouTube page. And if you look at this, there's a lot of information. You have bright thumbnails, text, view counts, channel names. There's a lot going on. And so what we did to lower the overloading of the information is we just added a blur and a vignette, forcing the viewer's eyes to look at what we wanted them to look at. We basically chose for the viewer where they were supposed to look at, making the overall message clearer and easy to understand. And this is a big thing I'll be talking about a little bit later, but for editing, you want to lead the viewer. You want to choose for them what they're looking at. And every cut, every edit, you want to think about where is the viewer looking at and where do I want them to look at next. And this leads us to mistake number 3, which is having jarring scene cuts. So here's the example. You have scene A and the subject is on the far left. Then the YouTuber cuts to scene B and all of a sudden the subject is on the far right. This is forcing the viewer's eyes to travel all this distance to focus on the proper subject or to focus on what they're supposed to look at. This makes it so hard for the viewer to really get into the video and follow along. The worst part is that if this video's cuts are a bit faster than usual, then by the time the viewer's eyes travel to the actual subject, the scene is already cut and they completely missed what was going on here. Again, this could have been the most interesting subject in the world here, but if the viewer doesn't have time to see it, then they can't be intrigued. Now, example 4 when it comes to viewer gaze is leading the viewer. This is an example screenshot from a video I was revising earlier today. And the editor chose to throw in this screenshot from a book to support something that had been said earlier. The only issue here is, as the viewer, what am I supposed to look at? There's 9 different elements to look at. This is why leading the viewer is so important. Instead of having them have to pause the video and read through everything to understand what they're supposed to be looking at, you want to lead for them. So what I did here in this example optimized version is I removed all the irrelevant elements, I zoomed in on the thing that was important, and I highlighted the specific text that was relevant to what the voiceover was saying. And when it comes to leading the viewer, circles, arrows, zooms, cropping, those are all going to be your best friend. As you can probably tell by now, clarity is super important. People can't be intrigued by your thumbnails and titles if they can't even understand them in the first place. And viewers can't enjoy the video if they don't even know where to look at. But to be honest, this slide deck was getting a little bit long, so if you want me to do these last 2 parts, let me know in the comments below and I'll do that.